Hello and welcome to Piece of Pod, a podcast brought to you by South Coast law firm Warner Goodman. I'm Sarah Whitemore. I'm an employment lawyer and senior partner in the firm with over 30 years of experience. In this podcast, I'll be having conversations with law firm partners, business owners, clients and other contacts of mine, and we'll be engaging in conversations about running businesses, career journeys, and how to excel in the world of work. So if that's of interest, why not grab yourself a cuppa, get yourself comfortable, and let's dive in. My guest today is Rebecca Beard. She's one half of the double act that owns and manages the HR consultancy Peas in a Pod. You might have heard me say that before because that exact same phrase was used in a previous episode when I spoke with Kay Coombs, her partner. Not to be confused, of course, with Peas in a Pod, which is what our podcast is called, but a very similar name, and it helps you to remember it. I couldn't help but notice on your LinkedIn profile that you have an LLB, which is, of course, a law degree, and that your specialism was employment law. So I'm a little bit curious as to how that led into running an HR consultancy, but we'll explore all of that on the podcast.
That's great.
First things first, we always start with career journeys. So what did you want to be when you left school?
I wanted to be a journalist, actually. And I'm not quite sure why. I very much loved English and media, and I think it was probably centred around that. But it's funny because if I take it back to when I was 12, my father, who ran his own chain of fish and chip shops, growing up, very working class, born and bred industry, and he made a lot of money, which was great. But I remember there was a particular incident when I was 12 where my father got taken to court, him and his business partner, by a husband and wife team at the time who were managing one of the shops. And I remember the tribunal case was ending on a Friday, and we were due to go to Centre Parks that weekend as a family. So my father didn't arrive until later in the day, and he was in a really bad place because he had effectively lost the case, which was an unfair dismissal claim that had been made against him. And that was back in the day where the procedurally unfair and substantially unfair tests looked slightly different, and they had messed up the procedure associated with the dismissal process.
Which is often the way. Most unfair dismissals are about procedure failings rather than the substantive issues, but yes.
Yeah, and unfortunately the tribunal made an example of them as a small business, and so as a result, my father, it didn't ruin the weekend, but I just remember at that point seeing my father that angry and that upset and feeling that it wasn't right, that it wasn't fair. He admitted the procedures, but ultimately the reasoning. My father's a very fair man. He's my role model. He's my hero. He always has been. And I would never question or fault his integrity. So it just felt unfair to me because of what he was telling me, obviously with my 12-year-old brain at the time. And I think that probably had always subconsciously affected me to the point where that may well have been something that ultimately led me to wanting to start the business in the first place, and my interest in employment law as a result. So yeah, that was probably one of those defining moments for me.
But so you started that by saying you wanted to do journalism, and I'm interested in how your father and his unfair dismissal became journalism, and indeed journalism became a law degree.
I think it's a bit like my son at the moment. He's 12 and he's saying he wants to become an engineer, for example. I think it's one of those things that I thought journalism was one of those things I think I wanted to do. But that case then happened. I then had my first job, ironically also in a fish and chip shop. That had nothing to do with my father. But it was run by a gentleman who perhaps wasn't fulfilling his obligations towards the tax office, towards the HMRC, and he also wasn't fulfilling his obligations to us as employees. And it took me a while of working there before I realised that I was entitled to holiday pay. Mm-hmm. And my father, I was 15 at the time, and I really wanted my dad to go in and just tell this man off for me and get me the money that I had become enlightened to the fact that I was owed. And my father didn't do that. He equipped me with all of the knowledge I needed to be able to go in and advocate on my own behalf. and I had the golden ticket line at the end if he wasn't prepared to listen to me, to perhaps suggest that I would be reporting him to the appropriate agency if he didn't give me what I was entitled to. And I came out with my £60 in holiday pay. Yeah. And I think as my time went on, and I grew into, and I got to the age of 17, and I knew I wanted to go to university, and I wasn't that clear about what I wanted to do. I think those types of incidents in my life, that they affected that decision to then move to then pursue a law degree. A law degree,
yeah. Interesting what your dad did there, though, isn't it? Because we do see from time to time parents getting involved in employment issues. You know, parents ringing in when their child is going to be off sick, or I say child, grown adults who are actually in the workplace. You know, parents sort of taking over that. And it doesn't really equip the employee for dealing with those things time and again as they arise, or being able to justify their own existence, stand on their own 2 feet, all that sort of that. So your dad taught a really good lesson there, I think.
I think self-advocacy just generally. I also remember when I had my first phone contract, it was with Orange at the time, I think it was, and I remember I discovered that they had been charging me. It's when you used to get charged 10p for every text message you used to send. That shows how old I am. And I remember scrutinising my bill one day and realising I'd been charged for this text message bundle I hadn't received. And again, it's those times in my life where I would go to my father to get him to help me, and he wouldn't write the letter for me to Orange. He helped me work out what were the key, either contractual or legal considerations that I needed to communicate with them to help to get to a resolution, to help them understand. And I think it's that self-advocacy piece that's always been inbred in my childhood and my teenage years, that probably again helped root my mind towards wanting to do follow some sort of legal career. So whether it's employment law or contractual law, and the two inherently overlap, it's that understanding your rights, understanding what you're entitled to, and being able to advocate on your own behalf to make sure you get them. And that's something that my father very much taught me throughout my teenage.
And I love what your dad did there, because there's the old Jesuit expression, isn't there? Teach a man to fish and he'll feed. Give a man a fish, he'll eat for the day. Yeah. Teach a man to fish and he'll eat for life, or something along those lines. That's the kind of sort of philosophy that your dad was embodying there, wasn't it?
Same principles, absolutely.
I might be able to sort your problem out for you, but that only sorts it out this one time. Yeah. Whereas if I teach you to sort it out, you can sort problems forever.
And however frustrating it was, and I remember I was 22, 23, and I had an issue with HMRC where I hadn't had my company car declared, and so I had issues with back underpayment of tax, and again I was then frustrated with my ex-employer at the time. I was having to deal with HMRC, and they'd got the calculations slightly wrong, and it felt like a big mess. And again, my father does that job of unpicking it and helping me break it down, and helping me work out what my rights are, what my responsibilities were, and then again doing that self-advocacy piece to the respective organisations to resolve the matter. And that has been an inherent factor of our relationship my entire life. And I might need it now. I'm 43. I might need him less and less to do that for me, but the reason I have those skills, absolutely, is because of him. And it's something I'm now teaching in my children.
I was going to say a lot of parents could do with listening to this and implementing that with their own children, but also a lot of managers implementing it with their team members and colleagues and that sort of thing. It's all about equipping people to do things on a regular basis rather than doing it for them. Sometimes when we talk about delegation, you sort of think, I could just do it myself, it'd be so much quicker. Yeah. But actually you're not upskilling people, and no one learns. Exactly. Now, I asked Kay this on the previous episode, what inspired you to start Peas in a Pod Consulting? And I'm going to ask you the same question, and we'll perhaps listen back to the previous episode and see whether you are aligned. But what inspired you to start?
So I think those two instances in my childhood that I've referred to, they were subliminally helping getting me into that mindset of wanting to do something like this. for a business. I think the actual catalyst when it came to it, and the day we actually registered the business, because it was my idea, I was determined to move forward with it, was we had both reached a level in our careers where we were quite senior managers, and unfortunately the level of HR support, or the calibre of the HR support that we were receiving within our respective organisations, was perhaps not as operationally or strategically focused as I would have wanted it to have been. And the problem is, by this point, I'd done quite a lot of pro bono work. I've represented in tribunal before I even started the business, three or four times. Again, that's my sense of justice. When I've had a family member or a friend that have been treated badly, and all of a sudden I'm taking the case on, and 6 months later I'm exhausted because I haven't realised what I quite got myself into. And I think that I always felt like I was butting heads, or that the HR team that I was working with were being quite obstructive, fearful, concerned with the legal risk, and not necessarily being concerned with the operational needs of the business. So if I wanted to performance manage somebody, or I wanted to deal with somebody's behaviour with the view to perhaps moving them out of the organisation because I didn't think they were a fit, I was always met with resistance and reasons that I couldn't do it. And I felt like my HR teams were never brave enough, or maybe equipped or skilled enough to be able to provide me with the actual support and the expertise that I would have needed to be able to do those things in the safest way possible. And that infuriated me, and it made me realise that there was a gap in the market for me, where I wanted small and micro businesses to have access to this really hands-on, operationally focused HR support and advice that was delivered in a really hands-on, common sense, easy to understand way that small business owners could get on board with and understand.
And Kay talked in her episode a lot about values and culture and how that impacts on performance. But do you think it genuinely impacts on day-to-day performance for individuals? Yes, I do. I think the culture piece for me is key. If I didn't have K side of the business in place, it would make it a lot harder for me to come in and then do my job. I think the culture piece and the values that underpin that culture are key in my ability to be able to manage underperformance, in terms of being able to refer to the expectations, the behavioural expectations that an organisation has in place. And I think in absence of those conduct competencies being defined in the first place, it makes it much harder to do my job when we are dealing with a behavioural issue, for example. I think when we talk about performance management, we tend to split it. The first need is to split it between understanding whether it's a capability issue or a conduct issue. So is it a will versus skill? Is it a can do or can't do scenario? And I think that capability scenarios are generally quite clear cut. They're generally quite black and white. We generally find that an organisation understands what the technical requirements are of a job and therefore can manage against those technical requirements. But the behavioural requirements of a role, I think, and of an organisation or a workforce, I think is less understood. And when it's not defined, it makes it that much harder for me to then be able to come in and deal with those particular behavioural issues. And so would you say, reflecting back on the work that Kay does as well, that managers should be using their values to guide their conversations when they're having conversations with people who are underperforming? Is that how it kind of works?
I don't think that's the starting step. I think managers should be using those behaviours and those expectations before they've even got to recruitment stage. I think it should be inherent in every process that the organisation has to do with their people. So I feel if an organisation hasn't defined the behavioural competencies required for a role before they've even put the advert out, then they don't know what they're recruiting to. They don't. It's very easy to give a 10 bullet point list to a recruiter and say, this is what we need. But how we need the job done is something that quite often gets missed. So when we put job descriptions together for our clients, we don't call them job descriptions, we call them role profiles. We make sure that that document is not just made up of that bullet point list of technical competencies, but it's made up of the way we need this person to behave. What are the behavioural competencies that underpin that? And also, how does that role play into the overall mission of the organisation, and how have we defined that? And making sure that role profile therefore covers all of that piece. And that then makes it much easier to use as an assessment tool when you are then recruiting somebody into that role. So I think it's not just, I think the mistake that some organisations use is to suddenly define what's important behaviourally, so a code of conduct or something equally clinical, or your misconduct list on your disciplinary policy. But the point being is it's much more proactive than that. It should be much more proactive than that. And when it is used as a tool in a really proactive way, you're hiring to it as well as firing to it or managing to it, and that then reduces it quite often reduces the need to manage to it and to fire to it. Because if you've been that clear from the beginning, whether it's recruitment, whether it's interview, whether it's onboarding, whether it's induction, whether it's proactive performance reviews, all the way through around the behavioural expectations that underpin those values, then people are really, really clear. And when people are really clear of what's expected for them, one, they get to make the decision whether the job's right for them in the first place, based on that alignment that's expected. And when they don't do it, it does become really obvious. And then quite often then they're highlighted as a minority within the workforce. And that behaviour then becomes that much more emulated in terms of it sticking out like a sore thumb. And then it makes it much easier for the manager to be able to, one, identify it at an earlier stage, and two, then manage it quite proactively.
And all of this is going to become even more important, isn't it, as we go into the world of the Employment Rights Act, as it will be, the Employment Rights Bill, where there's the removal of the 2-year qualifying period for unfair dismissal. Yeah. The importance of our recruitment processes, our onboarding processes, how we manage our staff is going to be so much more important, because we can't just take a chance on someone and pop someone in and hope for the best and then maybe manage them out through probation or whatever going forward. It's going to be much more important, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think we all have our opinions on the Employment Rights Bill and the removal of these day one unfair dismissal rights. But I think this is an area where it's always been a vulnerability, a legal vulnerability of an employer. I hate nothing more than when a client phones me up and says that they want me to remove somebody from the organisation because they're not the correct culture fit. Mm-hmm. But the person has been employed for 18 months. Mm-hmm. And there's an authenticity issue for me there, because why didn't they work that out in the probationary period? On a common sense approach, how could they not do that? So I think that although these laws are going to be quite a big shock, I think that there is a need anyway for organisations to be able to authentically say, you don't fit with our culture. They need to be able they needed to have been able to identify what that culture fit is from the outset and recruit to it. So you can then assess that person in those first few months to work out whether they are actually the person that they presented themselves to be, with the values that they presented themselves to have in that interview process. And if there's any disconnect there, then it will be highlighted quite quickly. And I think all this law does is place that obligation on the employer to not anymore be able to get to 18 months down the line and suddenly decide that they're not the right one. And I think that comes with its risks anyway. I think when employees are not clear around whether they fit into an organisation from a values alignment perspective, I think that if a manager suddenly makes that decision, that an employee is entitled to question whether that is the authentic reason for their ultimate dismissal if it goes down that route. route or not. And I'm sure you've probably seen through the cases you deal with, employees that make either a vexatious claim or they infer some alternative reason for their dismissal that's not related to the cultural fit assertion because of reasons like that those communications, that those values haven't been clear and haven't been communicated in for the first 18 months in post.
And I mean, I've been dealing with employment law for over 30 years now, so I've seen that eligibility period come and go. Yeah. We had a year as the eligibility for a while. We had 2 years prior to that and so on. And you do feel that 2 years is quite a long time that people have been in an organisation and then they're removed. Equally, day one rights is going to be a whole different ballgame, I think. But over my lifetime, I routinely say to employers, yes, you've got to have 2 years service for eligibility for unfair dismissal, but what about the automatic unfair dismissal things? Are they a whistleblower, trade union activist, health and safety rep? What about all the discrimination protections? And we've got obviously 9 protected characteristics. People have got so many other things that can give them scope to bring a claim even now before the law changes, that it's very risky to be going along the lines of it's not a cultural fit, because it's very difficult to evidence what does that mean, as you say, without having the role profiles that you've talked about in place and the culture that Kay talked about on the last episode.
Yeah, and I think it's not just the vulnerabilities that it creates. I think it's the feeling of uncomfortableness that managers and business leaders have in addressing what is effectively conduct or behavioural issues, right? And people call them attitudes. So bad attitudes. And I think inherently as human beings, we avoid that level of confrontation and conflict as standard. And I think what having really clear values of an organisation does, an organisation that's really clear around its sense of identity, has those values, has clearly defined the behavioural expectations that underpin those values. What that then means is that managers feel more confident, more equipped to be able to deal with those conversations, probably in the same way they do with capability. It makes it more black and white. It removes the subjectivity, the judgmental element from it, because you can point to what's important. One of our values is lead. We don't mind whether you're an administrator, whether you're one of our HR consultants. You lead from the position you're in. You use your initiative. You make mistakes. You admit to those mistakes. You find ways of being solution focused and helping the business move forward. And that's an expectation that we place on all of the roles within our organisation. So our staff are really, really clear around what that lead mentality looks and feels like. So then when somebody doesn't demonstrate it, it makes it much easier for KRI to have a conversation around where that disconnect is, why it is, and whether it's going to be a problem for the future of that person's employment or not. So it provides tools and resources in a way to give managers and business leaders the confidence to have those inherently quite conflicting conversations, and enables employees, I guess, to understand it in a way that feels less feels less opinionated. So it feels like your manager just has the opinion that you're not working hard enough or that your timekeeping's poor. It makes it, the observed behaviours makes it more black and white and more tangible in terms of the evidence.
So it sounds as though the senior leaders need to live these values in order to be able to police the values of the others. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, and again, I think that's another area of vulnerability that I see. I hate nothing more than when I'm in a potential disciplinary style meeting or a formal concerns meeting and an employee comes back at me and says, yes, you're right, I am not behaving in the correct way according to these values, but inherently nor is my manager or this organisation doesn't. And there's usually quite a lot of hostility, you can feel it. And sometimes those points are valid. We've had situations with an organisation where one of their values has been health and safety at the forefront, internally and externally. But unfortunately, when I have then had to come in and do an investigation around someone's conduct where there was a potential breach of health and safety protocols, they were able to throw back at me 5 or 6 incidents where their manager also didn't follow the risk assessments. And that then it harms the validity and the authenticity of those values, and it puts the leaders in a really vulnerable position where it shows that those values were actually just a marketing ploy the whole time, and nobody authentically is managing or leading or role modelling them. And yeah.
And some of them will then say, I don't live the values, but look at my results. Look at the sales figures. We've got prima donnas in organisations, haven't we, who are like, oh, I don't need to be involved in any of that culture stuff because I'm actually able to deliver on the numbers. How do we deal with those sorts of people?
I think that's an interesting one. You're talking about the concept of the toxic high performer there, which is a common issue that I quite often deal with, and it's a real problem for micro business owners. I think it's for the smaller organisations where they rely on every single role within an organisation, where you've got somebody who is performing, they're hitting the targets, they're hitting their figures, and their technical competency is second to none, but their behaviours are so harmful. And I think in that situation, both Kay and I, whichever one of us is dealing with that particular situation, has to do an education piece to the leader to help them understand how the tolerance of those behaviours impact on staff morale and ultimately, therefore, collective productivity. And I think that's something that's quite misunderstood. So yes, you might have one exemplary performer, but if that one performer is then going to affect and jeopardise the morale of the entire rest of the organisation, then in the long term, productivity will lower, and that one person will never be able to be relied upon to do the entire job of the workforce.
And I often think, everybody can see this is happening. If you go into a workplace, everybody knows it's happening. It's just usually the person who's in the decision maker who's trying to just sweep it under the carpet a bit. Yeah. So it just demonstrates to me that you need to be managing these things for the good of everybody, because they're looking to you to do that. You're the leader of the business. You should be.
It's an integrity piece for me, and I think that's why I never wanted to be a solicitor. and I nearly went down my ILEX route and qualified that way. But I like looking at all the various risks of an organisation. As solicitors, you guys are concerned with legal risk. I'm concerned with financial risk and reputational risk as well. If I have to go in and do a dismissal with an employee, I want to do that in the most authentic way. And I have had scenarios, as Kay will tell you, where I've had somebody shake my hand. I've had people thank me for dismissing them in such a dignified way. And that's really easy to do when company values are felt and embodied into an organisation in a really, really real, alive way. And I think that's becoming much more important for business owners, that the Glassdoor audits, that there's so many more considerations now around your organisation's reputation to be a good employer that was never a concern maybe 30, 40 years ago. And that is a risk that businesses do need to consider. We've all heard about the big employers on the news where they're performing really, really well, but the toxicity of the leadership team has become exposed, usually by a bunch of disgruntled ex-employees. And the Brewdog case probably 2 or 3 years ago was a good example of that. And that effectively, and that does have an impact on shared values. And so yes, it should be something that should be a priority for business leaders, if nothing else from a personal integrity perspective.
And I can hear, you're passionate, aren't you, about changing how HR is perceived. I can kind of hear that whole thing. What do you think the biggest misconception is about HR, and how do you think businesses should rethink that role?
I think the biggest misconception about HR is that we're just there to create obstacles, that we can't be operational or solution focused. We can't align to the operational needs of the business, and that we're simply there to tell somebody when they've got a poor hygiene issue. I think all of those historic perceptions and stereotypes around HR, I think, are still there in some way, shape or form in certain organisations. Don't get me wrong, we work with some really dynamic organisations that bring us in from the outset, that understand what they need from us without us even having to tell them what we can do. And that's amazing. But we equally still encounter those probably more traditional business leaders that still have quite an old-fashioned or traditional view around what HR is and what it does. And for me, our place is at the boardroom, place in the boardroom, creating that people strategy to underpin those operational or strategic planning.
And there always used to be a perception that HR wasn't at the boardroom table. You'd have the finance director, the marketing director, maybe the sales director, obviously the CEO, but HR would be outside somewhere. Yeah. Are you seeing them increasingly brought into the boardroom, or do we still have that issue?
I think from some of the community groups I'm on, especially with internal HR teams, I feel like probably in the larger organisations, I'm not sure if that is as... There will always be I suspect there will always be a HR director in the boardrooms these days in your national and your global organisations, and that strategy piece is probably much more clear cut because these organisations have really clear cut 3-year strategic plans and people strategies that underpin them. I think in the smaller organisations, it's probably less understood in terms of the value that HR can have. Which is disappointing because I think there's a widely understood belief that your people are the engine of an organisation. They're effectively what's going to make or break a company. And business leaders seem to understand that. But whether that then translates to the level of investment they then put in to that people and culture support is sometimes a different story.
And when you talk about understanding the culture and the values and that helping you in terms of performance management, presumably as an HR professional, if you're at the boardroom table and you understand the strategy and you understand the sales process and you understand all the things that are talked about at the strategic level, that helps you in terms of your people strategy. That helps you in terms of, well, what is this engine supposed to be delivering? You know, and it strikes me that if there's a disconnect, if you're not at that table, then how are you going to implement the things that they want done?
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think when HR don't hear it firsthand and don't get that space and that forum to be able to input into those conversations, I think that then all of the planning processes that take place in those boardrooms then become potentially flawed or weaker as a result of that voice not being present. Yeah.
On your LinkedIn profile, I read it. You describe yourself as a disruptive HR consultant. What does that mean?
I think that means if we get brought into an organisation and we are not treated, or HR or the people and culture support is not treated with the level of value that we know it can have, we very quickly get to a point with a client where we have some quite hard-hitting conversations around whether we are the best provider for them. I don't get my kicks from going in and dismissing people, and I have to do that quite a lot for the role I play in the business. I don't want to be doing that. I want much more emphasis on putting in place the infrastructure, the tools, the resources, the support, the education for leaders to make them so amazing at their jobs that people feel supported, they feel empowered, they feel enabled, so we don't ever have to get to that stage. And I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
I was just asking what disruptive HR consultant meant.
So for me, it's pretty much doing myself out of a job from in terms of the job that I do within the organisation. I don't want to have to do it. And if there are other ways of resolving a problem, I'm a workplace and an employment mediator now, because I understand the value of talking therapies and helping people understand each other from each other's perspectives and where they come from. I think there's so many different, better ways to manage and support people, and that's probably where that disruptive bit comes in, as well as if you're not going to place the value on it, if you're not going to invest in it, we can't have the impact that we want to have within the organisations we work with. And for me, we're impact-driven people. And if we can't hit that impact, then we don't get our own motivators met. And then we're not the best at what we do. So I will have quite hard-hitting conversations quite quickly with clients if they don't align to that same set of values.
Just going back to sort of performance management, because I know that's really your side of the business, isn't it? What would you say are the biggest mistakes that businesses make in performance management?
avoiding it. I think there's two things. There's not putting in place the structure and the tools and the procedures to deal with it, even though we know they exist in law anyway. The ignorance of them is generally one of the first hurdles, and then avoiding having those accountable conversations, I would say, would be the two.
And why do you think they do that?
Again, quite often with the businesses we work with, we love working with specialists in their field, entrepreneurs that have grown a business from what they do best. Now, that when they decided to do that, when their businesses took off, because they're so amazing at what they do. My husband's a personal trainer and opened a gym. He hasn't got a clue about managing people. My dad worked in a fish and chip trade and then opened some shops. He did. My uncle's a mechanic who opened his own garage. Just because they've got those skill sets in terms of the technical skills of the actual work that they do, the concept of managing and leading people and being a great role model from a leadership perspective is not something that these people are trained on. And I think as a result, having quite direct conversations around people's performance is something that inherently feels uncomfortable if you're not equipped with the skills, the knowledge, and have the confidence to be able to ultimately have those conversations. And I think that's where avoidance comes in.
So going back to your dad and his training you to have your conversations with the various people, is that what you do with businesses then? Is you empower them to have these conversations themselves so that they can then in the future do that? Yeah,
so we run a lot of training and workshops on various different areas, effective recruitment, the difference between managing conduct versus managing capability, absence management and the different concepts around that. And for me, there's nothing better than when a manager takes the training and the education and the coaching support, because we do quite a lot of leadership coaching as well with line managers, takes that knowledge and really then applies it in real life scenarios, and then comes back and disseminates with us, debriefs with us those different scenarios that they've encountered, and we love that. Equally, I will, in quite a hands-on way, come in and do that for a manager or a business leader if they've become so out of their depth and it's become so tangled. The environment's become so toxic, the scenario's become so toxic, that actually they just need somebody skilled to come in and deal with it, to remove the issues so they can then get on and focus with the job ahead. So yeah, it's that education piece, but also coming in and doing it for them.
There's not always this sort of lead-in time, is there, to enable you to train someone to do something, but presumably after they've rushed through and you've done this particular one, then they need to take the time to upskill and make sure that they're ready for the next one. Because I guess going back to you and your holiday pay issue with the fish and chip shop, at the time you probably thought, God, Dad, it would just go in there and have the conversation for me. Yeah. But actually, as we've discussed, it's something that's then lived with you and you've been able to bring it into other aspects of your life.
Absolutely, and I think there's a point here around accidental managers, when people fall into management positions, and actually a lot of what I do exposes whether managers are going to ever get on board with these skill sets that's required to lead people in the future, especially in line with these new laws. And ultimately I'm concerned with risk to an organisation, right? Especially micro businesses, where you can make or break based on one leader, if there's only one or two leaders in an organisation. And if the leaders are never going to acquire these skills, a lot of what I do will expose that one way or the other. I can do the education piece, I can do it for them, they can watch it occur, they can see the right ways of doing it, they can have one-to-one management coaching. But ultimately, if they're never going to get to that point where they're going to be able to eventually have that conversation themselves in a really safe, really effective way, then the question then has to come: Are they the right leader in the right role for that particular organisation? So I think, and most of the time they are, and it's great. But I think there is some value in highlighting some of those potential risks associated with your management or your leadership team, and being able to address them in a really proactive way, especially when we know what's coming. I think that's going to become increasingly important for leaders for business owners to really assess the calibre and the skill sets of their leadership teams in terms of being able to manage and assess people's fit in a workplace in line with what we know is coming.
Yeah, and maybe leave the mechanics doing mechanics and someone else runs the garage, or the PT doing the personal training and somebody else runs the gym or whatever. And it's hard once they've been promoted up to take people back, isn't it? But
I think the great thing about when you're having really clear conversations about and communicating from an interview stage the expectations of an organisation or of a role, I think one of the things that also does is when it gets to the point where the realisation that this position has become untenable, when somebody doesn't step up, when it becomes obvious that somebody's skill set is not where it needs to be able to perform this role, it makes it easier to I guess put that conclusion on the table in terms of an open discussion, because employees will always see it coming. When you've been unrelented around your expectations and consistent and pragmatic in your approach about communicating them, an employee is never going to feel blindsided when you have to turn around and say, do you think this is the right job for you? They're going to have come to that conclusion themselves before you've even asked that question. So at the point where you ask them that question, they've already probably worked out, or in my experience they have, that they aren't the right leader for this organisation. So it makes it much easier in terms of not having to demote somebody. They effectively come to their own conclusion that that's the right thing for them to move probably back into the role that they had before. And half the time you get them to the realisation that they never wanted to be a line manager in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I see that all the time.
Yeah, absolutely right. So you're running your own business. You've been running it for 9 years with a friend from 20 years. What's it like running a business with someone you know so well?
It's funny because we got asked to do a keynote speech at the university a couple of weeks ago, and we got asked to talk about our journey. And one of the things I said in it is that yes, we've been best friends for 20 years, business partners for 9 years, and we are still best friends, and despite being very, very different people, which means that we must understand teamwork and leadership to a level that means that we have always been able to compartmentalise when we're business partners and when we're best friends. And I think one of the key things for that is, although we're really, really different people, we absolutely respect the fact that if we were both the same or we were more similar, the business probably wouldn't work. I am the really direct one. I'm the assertive one. I'm the one that has to manage risk. I mediate. I tell it as it is. I'm generally fueled by caffeine, sugar, and apparently higher than average testosterone levels. Kay is the people pleaser. She's the kind one. She's the fair one. She's the one that's running behind me when I'm ripping off plasters, making sure that nobody gets hurt in the process. And I think that's always worked really, really well with our friendship, and it really works well in our business because there's two very different approaches. Kay's the visionary. She's the blue sky thinker for the company. I'm the one that wants a business case before I'll say yes to anything. I'm the cynical realist. And I think you need both those types of personalities within a business to make it work and to balance each other out. And I think the key takeaway for us is that whenever there's potential moments of conflict, and we both see conflict in a really healthy way, we're able to separate intention from outcome. So if we end up upsetting each other, if we end up doing something that screws each other over, it's that the intention was never to do that. And I think being able to, and it's a really good principle to adopt in any scenario, I think in any relationship where there's conflict at the heart of it. If there's never the intention to reach the outcome that has become harmful, then, and being able to separate those two things, I think are really, really key in terms of being able to put it in its place in terms of the impact that it has on the friendship. So yeah, I think being really, really different really benefits the business and has got us to where we are. And I think that our approach to conflict and the way we see it and the way we deal with it is the second thing that keeps that friendship at the first and foremost priority.
Brilliant. Well, any other top tips?
I think it would. I think for me, and I think you would probably agree with this, it's that the law is going to significantly change in the next year or so, And I think business owners that are ignorant to that need to upskill quickly. They need to educate themselves really quickly around what's coming and how this is going to affect their business operationally, and the increased risks that these new laws are going to create. So yeah, if there's one tip, I'm harping on about it to whoever I'm talking to at the moment, it's educate yourself as to what's coming and make sure that your business has the policies, the tools, the resources effectively that you're equipped to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, you probably know this from talking to Kath Dixon as well. We've put together a kind of 6-month programme, our Make Work Pay programme, to get businesses from where they are now to where they need to be to tackle the things that are coming down the line. And it's only just gone live, and we've got masses of interest already in it because there is a whole load of awareness out there and people are getting on board, but there's a lot of work to be done in a lot of businesses, as you well know. And
I really love that. Funny enough, I was looking at that programme last week, and I really like the way it's structured and broken down. And I think you're right. I think the level of investment you're putting into that level of support for your clients is going to be key in terms of helping them through this and getting them to where they need to be, so they are safe and they are equipped.
Yeah. Well, we've got to that point in the podcast where it's the audience sourced question time, and your question is in this envelope here.
Thank you so much. Let's see. What would 10-year-old you think of you now? And as a supplemental, what advice would you give them looking back?
I suppose you could go 12-year-old you, because 12-year-old you was at Centre Parks with your dad.
Yeah, okay, let's do that. I think my parents, my cousins, my brother, my family would all say I was a very feisty character. I was always very opinionated. I had this real sense of justice, and if that was ever violated or harmed in any way, I would get very animated. So I think the 12-year-old version of me now would be impressed that I managed to harness that energy in a professional way and control it to be able to provide and deliver what I think is quite a valuable professional service to other business owners. As to what advice would I have given them looking back, I think it would be to have more confidence in some of the situations I encountered in my early adulthood, to realise that most people in life are just blagging it. And actually, I'm thinking of one particular tribunal case that I represented on, and I feel like I settled too early. I was 24, 25. And although I hadn't managed to allow myself to be intimidated by the legal team that I was up against, when it came to that final hurdle and they threw in a settlement after day one because they realised I was actually more competent than what they thought I was, I wished I hadn't have accepted it. So my advice to my 12-year-old self would be, when that case comes round, don't settle.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time today, Rebecca. It's been lovely chatting with you, and we'll carry on the conversation offline, no doubt.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. I hope you found it insightful and empowering. To stay connected, why not hit the subscribe button? Or if you think your friends might be interested, why not rate us as a 5? To be first to know about upcoming episodes, follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram and LinkedIn, where you'll find us at Warner Goodman LLP, or follow us on YouTube, where our episodes are at Piece of Pod. Thank you again. Until next time.